Welcome to False Market Value, a podcast featuring real-world analysis of fictional sponsorships from movies, TV, books, music, and other pop culture. This episode is produced by DJ Cruiser and KSD Studios in Fort Mill, South Carolina. I'm your host, Ross Kennerly, founder of Quant Sponsorship Consulting in Las Vegas. In this part 2 of our conversation about Verizon Wireless's presenting sponsorship of the Indominus Rex exhibition from Jurassic World, founder and CEO of JSB Partnership Consultants Dan Kowitz and I dive deep into, as he puts it, the places and spaces in the park, the proper timing for approaching not just presenting, but any potential sponsors. Spoiler alert, it's not 3 weeks before opening day. And what the go-to-market ask could have been for a brand new exhibition in a fictional theme park on a fictional island in Central America, featuring a murderous, they say in the film, Indominus Rex does kill for sport, genetically modified theropod. The year is 2015. The movie is Jurassic World. The sponsorship is the Indominus Rex presented by Verizon Wireless. And this is False Market Value. Let's get into some of the assets. So here's the thing that I wanted to ask you about, and I think it's an important point. I think it'll be important to folks that are listening to this. Looking at physical assets, so physical spaces, I'm just going to list a few. So there's a dock for a fleet of catamarans, and apparently there are cruise ships that also dock there. There's a monorail that they use as a people mover. There's a natural feature called the Jungle River, which is part of Island Nublar, but they're using it at one point in the film as a lazy river where people are floating down on tubes and going by the stegosaurs. Then there's the aviary, the genetics lab, which I believe is the one that's named by Hammond. There's the Samsung Innovation Center, the lagoon, there's a Gentle Giants petting zoo, there's a T-Rex enclosure. Here's the thing. The only ones that are named or have a sponsor, and the park's been in operation for years, is the Samsung Innovation Center and Hammond's naming rights to the lab, and then this Verizon Wireless interest in sponsoring this new exhibit. Right. My question for you is, having worked on the side of the cultural institutions, both of us having some experience working with theme parks, either as consultants or, whatever the situation was in our careers, why aren't there more corporations at the time that the movie takes place in 2015? It's not like that was a new concept when they opened the park. They said the park was under construction in 2002 and then opened in 2005. So it's been in operation at this point for 10 years. And 2002, 2003, 2004, 2005, there's a comment about, ballparks being named. That all happened in the late 90s, early 2000s, where that really became more commonplace. If Jurassic World opened around that time, why aren't we seeing more brands outside of that forum mixed retail area where they're doing all the promotional tie-ins? There would have been at least 2-3 more opportunities that they could have sold, I think, to either a naming rights partner or a presenting sponsor or something. And we talked about this sort of at the beginning of the conversation, is about exhibit sponsorship. What should that have looked like when they opened this? Because a lot of these are permanent spaces.
Right. Well, I mean, from a movie perspective, they probably just didn't go that far. I mean, they went so far here in sponsorship and product placement, way more than most movies. But so the movie folks probably just, gave up after a while. I think if it's a real institution, what it comes down to is it depends on the experience. You're not typically going to find museums. They do it more on the philanthropic side, naming places and spaces. From a corporate perspective, and I'm going to fast forward to today, because you were also asking about differences between 15 and even now 2023, coming up on 2024. Let's stick with Verizon. If I'm Verizon, how many places within the overall institution I name is one thing. Naming the whole thing, I mean, that's where sports started. We name the whole venue. But now we go to a sports stadium and we got all kinds of venues within that are also named. That hasn't happened quite as much in cultural. It'll happen more at entertainment or Six Flags and those kinds of things. But I think it's about the experience. I'm already, if I'm a big partner of yours, I'm already reaching all of your attendees. Hopefully, they're all coming through somewhere. They all notice me. So what what might be more appropriate is in all those things you mentioned in the park, if it's Verizon, an extension of their deal in 2023 could have been charging stations at every single one of those platforms or areas. Whether my name is on the platform or area, carry my experience out to each one of those locations. And if that doesn't work, maybe you have a brand that is perfect for each location. But I think here's the real trick too. So many nonprofits and experiences and culture institutions come at this from, it's just more places to put your name. Well, not a lot of brands are quite as attracted to that as, you told me about 5 other places that Verizon could have been recognized. Great. Yeah. So I get a banner there. Instead, talk to me about charging stations because they need it on the dock when they arrive, or they need it out there in left field, or we need it here and you're walking around this huge building and our food court has charging, but then we have it nowhere else, right? Well, work with the Verizon to provide it in multiple places within your location. The more that you can take a fit of their business, throughout the venue, I think that's more valuable than just name this certain area. And then I think, it depends on, you do have typically permanent areas that maybe don't attract as much as they used to because you got the new fancy thing coming along. If you can work with brand, though, to bring some new communication or food or beverage or experience or ride park, or now you get to see the Mercedes now back here in this exhibit nobody else used to go to, or a reason that to be there. And I think the trick is, don't just rely, if you're talking about assets and what you can offer to a sponsor, don't just think about the signage you can give them or just the fact that they can name a portion of. Think about what's actually going to happen there with them. That's more valuable.
Yeah. About signage, there's media screens I was going through and watching it with a more discerning eye this time. They're promoting food, cuisine, tennis courts, experiences, massages on media screens. They're all over the park. There's holograms throughout the Samsung Innovation Center, which we spend, when we're watching the film, there's a decent amount of time that they spend in that facility because of the holograms, and it has a pretty key moment at the end of the movie. I would say they're covered on signage. I think there's plenty of opportunities, to your point, to effectively recognize them. I'm just going through some of the assets here, looking at it from the customer's experience. So there's the temporary welcome, I guess you call them windjammers. I know you mentioned Taste of Chicago. I think they still do windjammers around the event that are, I'm assuming because it's in an area where there's a lot of hurricanes throughout the year, that they wanted something they could take down that isn't going to get ripped off like a giant sail and just tossed into the ocean. So they have windjammers. I mentioned all the media screens. There's in-room media that's tied into those media screens. And again, this is 2015, supposedly 2015, somewhat advanced technology at the time. ID badges, lanyards. There's holograms, which we had talked about. The brochure, which we talked about. There's a gift box that Claire's assistant opens up as soon as they get into so when the kids go in the hotel room, pops it up and starts pulling out electronics out of that, so you can do some sampling, it sounds like, from the folks that are staying at the hotel. And missed an important brand when we were going through the list. Hilton's the first brand you see. They have signage on the escalator as they're going up into the park, and then everyone stays at that Hilton on the island while they're there, except for, I'm assuming, the people that are on cruise ships. But they're covered on signage. There's plenty of opportunities to recognize them, but there's other ways to experience in the park. We mentioned that for a telecom partner, not having effective cell coverage, especially during a disaster, is probably not a good look for that partner. And if I were the person on the other side that was selling that, I would go to Verizon and say, hey, so we had this accident at the park where we weren't able to get cell coverage to all the people that were in the gyrosphere, and the gyrosphere shut down. Is that something that you could help us with? That seems like that would be sort of a good way to start that conversation. When they say, they come in, they say, oh, we want to be thrilled, we want to be dazzled, we want to be involved in the latest, greatest thing. And, if I'm Claire, I say, I need to make sure that if one of the assets gets out, it doesn't go on a rampage and I can't contact anybody that's in the center of the park.
100%. Or just in the fact that everybody's coming from some other place, right, to this remote island. And if they've improved communications and Verizon is known as helping you keep in touch back home, with everybody back home while you're here. Plus, here's what we've done to improve the park. That's the thing. And that fits for a Verizon, not going to be the same for, auto company. But here's another example, like just from a auto experience, right? Their product placement different than sponsorship. They're using the Mercedes all throughout the movie. But, if you're an auto company, and especially at an outdoor theme park, you have the ability to work with theme park to sort of put in not just a stand around it, look at it behind ropes kind of thing, but you can actually drive it, test track. That's not going to work down at MSI, but it's going to work up at Six Flags. Awesome. Those are the kinds of opportunities you can still add up from. I think one of the biggest points people ought to take up out it is when we do our work, we are definitely looking for all the places and spaces that you already have and what you do, right? And so you aren't going to ignore the fact that you have all these signage areas and pamphlets, and you do digital marketing, and you have different parts of the building. You have what you have, and you want to talk about that. What you need to layer on top of that is, who am I talking to? What can they bring as an improvement? Or how can I make that signage even more relevant? I just don't want to see just Verizon signs in the 10 places you have. If it's telling me that here's where I can find a charging station, that's the most relevant thing you could put on the sign beyond just a Verizon logo. So the more that you can do that, and the more that you can work with the brand to layer in the experiences on top of all the stuff you already normally do, now you're adding up to bigger fees.
With regard to fees, so let's touch on that, and let's do you mentioned a takeaway. It's a good one. I have one I think relates to that, and it relates to the sales process that I wanted to touch on. So there's a couple that I wanted to go through, but let's talk about fees, and then as that relates to 23. So was doing a little bit of, call it, benchmarking, comparable research just within telecom. I mentioned one that I was working on around a theme park around that same time. Here in Las Vegas, T-Mobile around the same time period bought naming rights to a very now famous venue for the Las Vegas Golden Knights. Verizon in 2017 invested in the city of Sacramento to develop its 5G network. So just in terms of benchmarks, so the T-Mobile agreement, at least what's been published, and again, that's one of the challenges with the industry that we work in, is that we're working a lot on published figures when it's released, and it's not always released. It's tough to go through, especially for theme parks. And this is some of the research that I've done in the past too, when working for a theme park, especially when you're working on the valuation side, to try and figure out exactly how much are companies or brands spending to have these types of experiences that we're talking about within a theme park. There isn't a whole lot of information out there because they're private corporations. They don't necessarily have to release that. So you're sort of held to whatever's been released if they talk about it at all, or work internally and have a general understanding. But even then, you can't share that with anybody if there's confidentiality around whatever the fee is that's paid. So we're going from, in terms of benchmarking, real world examples here. So what was published about Verizon Wireless, its investment in Sacramento, that was $100 million. And it was a 10-year deal. So figure $10 million a year on average. And it wasn't necessarily a sponsorship agreement, but it was definitely a partnership with the municipality. They were installing a lot of the infrastructure. There were some challenges around the rollout of 5G in that city. Then there was T-Mobile's published figure for sponsorship of T-Mobile Arena here in Las Vegas, which I mentioned, that was $5.9 million a year. So looking at T-Mobile's sponsorship of a ballpark in Seattle was $87.5 million over 25 years. That was sold in 2018. So 3 years after the context of the film. They would have been negotiating in 2016, probably 2016, 2017 timeframe, but that's $3.5 million a year on average. So just in terms of value, not so much from an asset perspective, but in terms of what, say, if Claire were to close that deal with Verizon, as she claims in the film, given that context of what's happening in telecom, I think for something that has an international audience, if you go through the credits at the end, the park visitors are from Germany, UK, Italy, China was another one. So it's an international audience that's coming to this park. There are 3.9 million passenger movements that are coming through the airport in Costa Rica, which is bringing folks to the island. And they say there's 20,000 people a day on average, and it's the holidays after hurricane season. There's 22,000 the day of the movie. So with that in mind, that's a pretty sizable audience, and they're all going to go see Indominus Rex exhibit because it sounds like it's open to everybody. So with that in mind, if it were me, I would probably take it out to market in the $3 to $4 million range, probably a year for an audience that size. And I think they'd probably land somewhere around 3, maybe a little bit less. How do you feel about that figure? Do you think I'm too high, too low? Goldilocks zone?
I think it's probably fairly close. The one thing that I caution cultural or entertainment venues against, that is a high audience. Even on the low end of your math, that's like at least 7.5 million people a year. That's a pretty high attendance. But we get that at Navy Pier in Chicago here. So here's I think for entertainment and cultural, here's the big thing to start with thinking about. You do have to figure out how many people we're getting a year. And then because there's cultural that gets 500,000 people a year, and here we're talking about 7.5 million in international. That's a big difference. But you also named in there some sports properties. Well, what we're forgetting there is they have broadcast, right? As well as in promotion out around the broadcast. So that extends the reach. Even if the arena only gets 1 million people a year, you got all that broadcast. So I've had clients where they're cultural, zoo, aquarium, museum, entertainment. I'm like, well, we get way more than the stadium here. Yeah, but you don't have broadcast, and you don't have any of that, and you don't have the fan reach outside of all of that. And so I think you do have to think about that, because you have a lot of cultural folks who always think they can get into the 7 figures. And we're not talking about naming the entire property, and we aren't here either. Verizon wasn't the entire property. It's a portion of it. I'm going to bet that that's a touch on the high end, but not too bad, because I've got other clients that are dealing with minor league stadiums who still get, a big audience a year, but then they also have broadcast. I think it also does come down to what we've been talking about earlier. Well, what's the experience and what else is going on there, and how can a Verizon play into it? And what is the total reach, and what can happen with that? And Jurassic World probably has a massive amount of coverage compared to, we're talking about like, it's not necessarily Disneyland on steroids because it's a different thing. But if you take it for what it is, there's like nothing else like it on the planet. Never ever been anything else like it on the planet.
It's so dinosaurs, right?
So that comes into play. If you come along, whoever you are, and you've got experience that there's nothing else like it on the planet, there's a premium for that. And so you're probably not too far off, at least in the go-to-market, because you've got some differentiators here. So maybe you're not a sports team with the broadcast, but there's nothing else like it, and you're not broadcasting live from there every day, but you can't get this experience anywhere else. So I'd say you're probably pretty close.
Yeah, one of the things I was thinking, and understand, when you start talking about what would an actual number for this be, again, this is all for entertainment value, but I think the takeaway there, what you just said, is the exposure it's going to receive with a broader audience, and what does that look like? So I would factor in the fact that Claire had said every time that we make an announcement that there's a new exhibition, new feature, a new attraction at this theme park, there's a spike of attendance, there's global coverage, there's celebrities there. That isn't necessarily something that, when you go through valuation, and this is one of my takeaways, just to sort of put a bow on that, it's something that you want to factor into as a qualitative benefit of sponsorship. It's like a press release. When you put a press release out about a partnership, it's something that is expected, first of all, on the brand side, especially if you're excited about it, because it gives you an opportunity to talk about why this relationship makes sense. Those are the qualitative things that add value to sponsorship that aren't necessarily something that you would put in a valuation as a line item, although I have seen that happen before. Sometimes that'll get worked in somehow. It's not a line item necessarily, but I would factor in on the qualitative side that there is that opportunity for exposure, especially early on. And then this is just for fun, as far as the term useful life of the asset for something like presenting sponsorship. So a Tyrannosaurus Rex, according to the Natural History Museum, only lives about 28 years. It's been 3 years. So I figure at max, it's a 25-year term. I would probably do 10. And then there'd be some extensions on there if Indominus Rex is still kicking after 10, 15 years since they manufactured this thing, and we have no idea how long it's going to be around.
And that's the difference in the entertainment cultural world. I mean, even in the stadium world, right? You don't tend to get more than 10-year deals, and most stadiums are looking at being rebuilt in 10 or 20 or 30 years. Here in the cultural world, they were not talking about naming the whole place. they were talking about naming the new exhibition, which even if that new exhibition is there for 28 years, they're more than likely never going to do more than a 10-year deal. And to your point, there is always this uptick in it's new. But if I'm signing a 10-year deal and I'm a smart company, I'm going to say, okay, but what's the 10-year average of attendance in PR? It's going to wear off. You've got stuff in your lab. You're inventing new stuff. So 3 years from now or 2 years from now, I'm not going to be the new thing.
Greatest thing.
So I'm not paying for the uplift just in year one. I'm paying for the average. And that's the details behind the scene that you got to get into. And I'm only naming a part of it. But I do think that it's not typical. You know this, and our audience should know, whoever's listening in. Sports is more where we see the 10-year deals. We don't tend to see 10-year plus deals in entertainment and exhibition and cultural institution. It's
3 to 5.
It's just not the reality of the situation. And so you got to be realistic about that too. And it is hard to find, like you pointed out. A lot of this isn't public, but on that side that's not sports, you're probably not getting more. And even if it's the new exhibition, my experience was more like you'd be doing well if you can get 2 to 3 for a brand new exhibition, even if it sticks. And then if it has that much staying power and is that cool, they're going to re-up.
All right, so we talked about term. We talked about benchmarking in terms of key takeaways. I want to talk about timing real quick. So when they visit the paddock for the Indominus Rex, it's under construction. There's nothing on the outside. They're barely showing it in. They're growing. And they said, oh, well, it's bigger than we anticipated. So this isn't going to be done until May, right? So there's 6-month lead time before the paddock's even done. It's 4 miles from the center of the park. But they said it's opening in 3 weeks. So is 3 weeks before your brand new exhibition, does that make sense to pull in a partner 3 weeks before that thing's going to be rolled out to the public?
Oh, not even close.
What should the lead time be? I mean, 6 months is short. It
depends. And in the entertainment world, it's gonna make a difference whether it's a permanent new attraction. This is a roller coaster. This is experience that's coming and it's staying, or it's temporary. So Titanic, going all the way back to the beginning, Titanic, the exhibition, that was just making a short run at MSI. 6 to 8 months. That was not a new permanent build of the building. Either way, permanent or temporary, you ought to be working with brands a year to 2 in advance when it's that big to talk about it, not only from a budgeting perspective, but also then if they're going to take full value and activate fully, they probably got to have a good 6 to 12 months to see the idea, budget for the idea. Once they've said yes to the idea, if they're doing their jobs and you're doing your job, you're going to have at least a 6 to 12 month then run up after they said yes to make sure that you're taking full advantage of all the pre-promotion and getting it in your channels, making sure all your stores around the country are all on board, because they're doing that stuff on events. So if you're going for something that big, not that you can't sell something last minute, but we're talking for something this big, a year to 2 lead in for budgeting, saying yes, and then all the marketing planning. So that was, that was not realistic at all.
No, and the fact that Verizon would have approached them 3 weeks before the exhibit went out, and that's what she pitches to them,
right?
They would say no. They would say no.
No.
I have one last key takeaway, and then Dan, any that you think we might have missed that you were thinking about as we were preparing this. So my last takeaway is this deal, even if all of those things that we just talked about that were problematic with how they sort of presented this to Verizon and all the challenges that they have in the park that Verizon could have fixed for them, significant presence for brands, not a whole lot of sponsorship, parks been in operation. She mentions that they're trying to offset costs, which is why they're going this route, which I feel like that's a whole other podcast where we can talk about how not to base sponsorship on just the cost of the asset, which is just, a no-brainer to us, maybe not to folks that are pursuing this for the first time, but like I said, that's a whole other conversation. This deal with Verizon, it would have never gone through. Here's why. If you read about, and there's actually a site dedicated, and I'm assuming it's a promotional tie-in to the film that hasn't been updated since 2015, but Masrani Global Corporation was founded in 1973 as Mazcom, which was Masrani's father's company. And it started as a cellular network that was available in 31 countries. They have a fleet of 100 plus satellites. They offer holographic phones, which was their entrance to the market, and they were 6 months from introducing the next generation at the time Masrani was killed in the film.
Right.
There were 6 months from releasing their next generation, call it the iPhone 12. It's the next iteration of whatever mobile device it was. So they did device manufacturing, and they were the mobile network, and they're available in 31 countries, including Costa Rica, because they have a local facility. Masrani does a local facility in Costa Rica in the context of this fictional company. He would have never let Verizon, or Samsung for that matter, have some sort of presence at that park. He would have just branded it with his own stuff.
No way. Well, it wouldn't happen if you're taking us back to where we started in our roots, Ross. Although I forget if you're actually a Detroit Lions fan or not. If you're the Ford family, for as long as you own that team and Ford Field in Detroit, you're not having Chevy as a sponsor. No. That's not going to happen. And even if we don't go so far as family owns or family has a business that's competing with sponsor, that's a big takeaway for many cultural institutions. You have some sort of ownership or stake from somebody that's a big competitor of your sponsor. Not going to happen. You got to think about that. Or here's a great one, because what happens in the cultural institution entertainment world is you get a lot of traveling entertainment and traveling exhibition. We always run up against this conflict of, well, is that traveling stuff coming with a sponsor that competes with one of ours? I had that situation with Sears in my day, where there was an exhibition coming to MSI that the team wanted to book, it was a Formula One race car that was only going to be at MSI for a month or two, but it was a Target race car. And Sears was one of my biggest sponsors at the time. We had actually written into Sears' contract, hey, there may be a time where we can't control traveling and what comes with it. We'll give you a heads up, but we had to deal with that, and that Sears just had to go with it. But optimally, that's not what's going to happen. So you definitely want to think about those things for sure.
So anything else? We've covered a lot in a short amount of time. Anything else from your perspective that you noticed watching it?
I think, if you translate the movie to real life, 15 or 23, the biggest things for folks to remember is you have what you have to offer, and the new big shiny thing is more valuable. But what's even more valuable is you don't just depend on your static assets. You talk to the brands, you think about what the brands want to do, you think about improving experience and actually integrating brand, if you can, across whatever you're doing. You're going to be able to ask for a lot more. You can't, if you're an institution that can't do anything about the fact that we draw 500,000 people a year, whether we bring a shiny new thing or not. I'm not going to compete price-wise with those who bring 3 million people a year. I'm just not. But if I can do a really great job and make sure that it's not just Verizon signs, we're actually enhancing the charging stations and the communications you get around the facility, that's worth a lot more, and translate that over to any other business or sector that might fit for whoever you are. And that makes it a lot more valuable than telling you you'll get your logo in 20 spots and on these pamphlets or digital signs. That's just a big takeaway. And you also weaved in earlier, ask. You don't just have to go out and pitch. Have a conversation and say, what do you guys think? How would you see it working? How would you want to be integrated? What are you trying to do in the marketplace right now? Ask a lot of questions to really figure it out. Obviously, that's not the point of the movie, so they didn't get into all of that. It wasn't a 101 on how to pitch Verizon. But as people translate this into how do I work with that? Whether or not you pay attention to it in movies or not, definitely take that and work with it on the street.
So it looks like our producer, DJ Cruiser, has a question. DJ.
I will tell you that I watched Jurassic World over the weekend just to refamiliarize myself with it because of the subject matter that we were talking about today. And I was hell-bent on looking for the branding in the movie. I mean, Bryce Dallas Howard said the thing about landing Verizon, and then I saw the thing about, 3 weeks. And the rest of the movie, I was like looking, and Mercedes was everywhere.
Right, they didn't even come back to really the Verizon thing.
Yeah, I mean, there was no other mention of it anywhere in the movie, and I was like looking for the Verizon like checkmark logo or something, and there was nothing there, and I was kind of flabbergasted because of the placement of that brand in the movie without any supporting anything anywhere else was kind of weird.
Right.
So what is your stance on that? Why did they just throw that in there, and what was the point of that?
That's a really good question from a movie perspective, right, Ross? Because if you study it, there's all this background and research on Jurassic World and all the product placement over the years and all of that.
Yep.
And right, so they did this really integrated great thing with Mercedes. They're using all the vehicles, they're introducing new vehicles. Mercedes was very careful during filming to not let it be seen because it was brand new. And Verizon does seem like, sorry for Verizon, a little bit more of a throw in there. And you would think if you were Verizon and you approved that, you would have wanted to have it integrated just a little bit more, where even if they didn't come back to the naming, maybe as you went through the movie, you did see some Verizon thing out in the park, or you saw a Verizon store down in the village, something to just make it seem like it went through and it came to life and we're actually here. You never see them again, right? So
yeah, they would have had a storefront, and there right. wasn't a storefront in that 100%. Retail area for Verizon at all. Well, technically they weren't a sponsor yet.
Right.
But if they did, that was another thing that I would do, is I would move that around. I mean, an easy way to fix park revenues is don't put the Starbucks next to the main attraction of the Samsung Innovation Facility. Put that at the other end so people have to go get their Starbucks and walk through all the other retailers, and put Verizon somewhere in the center. That's just me.
And Ross, here's one more thing. In the movie, what also never gets addressed again is the calamity of the whole situation, right? Which could happen in real life. We're talking about life and death now all of a sudden. So brands, properties, people who sell sponsorship are so worried about, well, is the company ethical, and did they just have an oil spill, and are they just trying to cover it up with a PR thing? But what we don't talk about as much is, okay, but what could happen at the property and affect the brand as well? So in Mercedes' case, it's kind of interesting because it's sort of worked out. It's like their rough and tumble vehicles and their other vehicles are helping people escape and doing their job even in the midst of calamity. Whereas with Verizon, and we don't come back to it, they've got communications challenges. They can't talk to each other, and people are dying.
To the Verizon folks,
right? And
did they get off the island before any of this happened?
So
because I don't think they did.
Right, and if depending on what kind of and we've had over the summer here, we've had some different roller coaster accidents, and stuff flying off roller coasters and cracks in roller coasters. So you got to think about that from both ways in terms of, we're worried about brands and their authentic side and their ethical side, and do we really want to partner with them? And if I'm a company, I got to think about the fact that if I'm signing a 10-year deal, or even a 2 to 5 to 3 to 5 year deal, am I okay with this property, and do I view it as something that's always going to be entertaining and not have issues? Not that anybody can project a piece falling off a roller coaster, but that affects your sponsorship too. All of a sudden they're in the news for bad press because something happened and somebody died at a Six Flags. That makes your sponsorship devalued big time in a big way. So that's the other thing that there's no ultimate solution for that. Both sides aren't going to stop doing sponsorship because something could happen. But I think it always, and I was on the property side more than the brand side, but it always frustrated me because we usually only talk about that from is the brand ethical side, but we got to think about it the other way too. So.
And there's things contractually, and let's have this be our last point, is contractually there are ways to protect both parties in an agreement if something like the asset runs rampant through the park. I know that's an extreme example and fictional. I was thinking, Dan, MSI, like the Body World's cadavers coming alive and just like wreaking havoc.
I'm just thinking about my three boys. My three boys are the asset running wild in the park. So yeah, I get it.
But in a real world scenario, if something happens like that, there are ways to protect yourself reputationally. There are ways to protect yourself. That's all contractually part of the discussion. And it always comes up, especially for organizations that are pursuing sponsorship for the first time on the consulting side, is, well, what if the brand does something that we don't like? But to your point, the thing they also have to think about is, how does a brand protect itself if for some reason the weather shuts down your event? And there are ways to do that in a contract to make sure everybody's comfortable, and it's a give and take, right? It's not just the brand's reputation, it's what happens with the property too, and the best contracts and the best partnerships work that out so they can overcome it.
Yep, 100%.
So we just covered off on key takeaways, term, I guess you could say a combination of a moral turpitude and a force majeure clause, and make goods, if you want to call it that. I remember working for the Fort Worth Stock Show and Rodeo when you and I worked together at IEG, and they had an event that was canceled due to some storm. And that was my first experience dealing with
hurricane.
Goods
I remember.
For the next year. Yeah. So I think those are all important for our listeners. I'd like to end on, call it a sillier takeaway. So one of the characters in the movie, and I want to read this quote. So he says, why don't you just go the distance when they're talking about, they ask her, Claire, did you close the deal with Verizon? She's like, oh yeah, Verizon Wireless presenting the Indominus Rex. And he says, why don't you just go the distance? Just let corporations name the dinosaurs. They've got all the ballparks. Why stop there? And the two examples he gives are Pepsi-saurus.
Right.
And Tostito-Don.
Love it.
So InGen has a questionable ethical history with merging species to come up with the latest and greatest cool dinosaur. You can only pick one. Which one is it and what goes in it? Herbivore or a carnivore, first of all? And what type of species do you put into the
I'm going with Pepsi-saurus and herbivore. I don't know, it just rolls off my tongue a little bit more. But I think it's such an interesting point in the movie, because especially on the cultural side of institutions, not as much in entertainment and outdoor, this question always comes up, literally, like, how far should we go in letting somebody name something? And when you're talking about zoos and aquariums and things that aren't inanimate objects, people actually bring it up and think about it from a money standpoint. But I think that it's got to be the right situation, right? But I would go Pepsi-saurus.
So let's say I'm a brand manager for Tostitos, right? I would want to, I would go with a Stegosaurus as sort of the base. And I mean, they're just playing with fire anyway. So let's give them some triangle scales to match the ones on the back and make sure they're red, like the.
Yeah, that can work. I like that.
Well, I guess I'm thinking Doritos, but I would do something that would tie into the brand colors, because they're already messing with cuttlefish to make camouflage for the Indominus Rex. So in the context of the film, why, like he says, why stop there? Let's make some brand colored dinosaurs.
And what they were previewing at the time is, and to your point, Tostitos is edible, right? And we got people being eaten by the end of the movie, so that one actually might have worked a little bit better.
Yeah, I don't know, but I think is there a limitation? Yes, it has to be organic and authentic to the experience, like having a decent, dependable mobile phone coverage for Verizon Wireless in the park, or for Mercedes to provide all the light, medium, heavy duty vehicles in a time of crisis, or something that adds value to the overall experience, or it's not going to work, because the exposure, as we talked about.
If I'm a zoo or an aquarium, I don't need to rename the mammals. But if I'm talking to an auto company and I can carve out space because I'm outdoor, where somebody can actually drive a Jeep over terrain and test it out, that fits. I don't have to rename the dolphin park. I don't have to rename an actual mammal. But if I can give you a Jeep experience on site, that's authentic. That's where we need to go.
Absolutely. Thank you to all of our listeners, and my thanks again to Dan Kowitz for joining me for this discussion. If you have a suggestion for a fictional sponsorship deal that you would like us to feature in a future episode of False Market Value, you can email your ideas to info@quantllc.net. I'm Ross Kennerly, and we'll see you next time.